Canadians just aren't traveling to the United States. Not only are they mad at President Donald Trump for threatening to make Canada the 51st state, but many fear that crossing the border has become too risky. They read news stories about innocent Canadians unnecessarily detained by U.S. border guards, some even taken into custody, forced to spend several weeks in American prisons before being freed after extensive media attention. This May long weekend, how worried should you be about crossing the border into the US? I spoke with Professor Emily Gilbert of the University of Toronto to find out. Professor Gilbert, we've got the May long weekend coming up, and Canadians they're staying away from the border for economic reasons, but many of them are, we've heard the stories about Canadians being stopped at the border, some of them being detained, even a few, winding up in prisons. Should Canadians be worried crossing the border into the US this weekend?
Yes, I do think that Canadians should be worried. I don't think everyone's going to be impacted. I don't think we're at the stage where everyone's at risk crossing the border. But because the way the border works with a lot of discretionary powers, and it often can be random the way people get picked out of line, I think everyone should be concerned about how they're going to approach the border. And then, of course, there are particular people who would have real concerns because they might be people who have been out loud about concerns about the Trump administration. They might be dual nationals coming from a country that we know Trump has targeted previously. He's also said he's going to bring in a new Muslim nation ban as well. So that would be an even longer list of countries that he has concerns with. If you were a dual citizen or a permanent resident who has affiliations with another country, I think I would be worried. I would be worried if you have friends and associations who might fall under those categories, because we do know that the US Customs, who are checking people as they cross the border, are going through people's social media. They're going through their phones, they're going through their laptops. So there's lots of ways that you could get into trouble, even if normally you're just a regular kind of person.
Um, I heard a story today, and I confess I read it on social media, so I can't verify it. But the gist of it was that a couple went across the border, or went to the border, and were asked specifically, "Do you like President Donald Trump?" And they said, "No, we don't," and they were turned away. And then they went to another border crossing nearby and they said yes, and they were admitted. And that seems like such an egregiously arbitrary kind of process, but really it's kind of built into the system, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've heard examples of that too, directly from friends and colleagues. I've also heard of lots of people who have crossed without any trouble at all. But I have heard of cases where somebody has been asked a very similar question. Do you like our current administration? Do you like our president? And even people who have been not even negative, but have been less than enthusiastic, have been refused entry. And in one case that I heard was actually banned for entry for 5 years. So there are ramifications of this. Now, it's not really appropriate for them to be asking those kinds of questions, but they do have the leniency to do so, and it is within the authority of the US border agents, as it is with Canadians, to refuse admittance to people who might threaten national security or are seen as a threat to the country. So that's a long, long stretch, right? To say that somebody, if they don't like your current president, is actually a threat to national security. But you can see how that logic kind of connects the dots in someone's mind if they want to make those kinds of connections. So yes, that might be an example from social media, but I've heard of people that I really trust say that they've had similar kinds of experiences or know of people who have.
So I'm a journalist. I've interviewed with the last 3 months. I don't a lot of people who have been critical, a lot of Americans who have been very critical of Donald Trump. And I've said things on social media. I've said things on the record about Donald Trump. Boy, if there was anybody that would be targeted, it would be me. And I would, of course, and all of that is all over social media, and it would be on my phone, which no doubt they would seize. What might happen to me given the current circumstances?
So it's most likely that somebody crossing the border from Canada to the United States at the land border would just be refused admission if they felt, or entry, sorry, admission, as if it's, you pay a price and you go in like the movies or something, refuse entry into the United States. So that is a possibility. And the worst case scenario is that you would be barred from the country for 5 or even 10 years, something along those lines. If you were flying from Canada at one of our international airports, you'd probably be stuck in customs here because we have the US customs at the Canadian airports, the international airports. So you probably even wouldn't make it like, very far. You wouldn't get on your plane. They just refuse you to board. So those are the kinds of implications that could happen. The stories we've heard of people going to prison, there was one case of somebody who crossed the land border inadvertently. They didn't know that they had crossed, and then they were actually illegally entered the United States, and there they were actually detained for over a week. There was another case of a woman who was a Canadian, but she was crossing at the US Mexico border. She was also detained because she wasn't quite adhering to her work contract. Those I think we're hearing more and more examples. So I'm not saying that would never happen, but I think for somebody like you or somebody like me who's also been vocal about my opposition and displeasure with the American government currently, I think chances are that we would just be refused entry and then potentially barred for 5, maybe 10 years, something along those lines.
Now, you've done some academic work on this and introduced the idea of elasticity. And if you could maybe explain that for my viewers, please.
Yeah, so what I was trying to get across with this idea of elasticity of the border, thinking about the Canada-US border and our relation together, is how much cooperation there is between the two countries. For example, the pre-clearance that I just mentioned that we have at our international airports, where we effectively have on Canadian soil US border agents who are implementing US border and customs protocol on our border within Canada. And so it's a kind of like a little island of the United States within Canada. So the Canadian Charter of Rights right as a Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms actually applies in these jurisdictions. But it is also a place where US immigration controls are also being applied. So we have this overlapping of jurisdiction, which is bringing and extending the border far away from like the 49th parallel, which we often associate with the border, into Canada, and creating this kind of context where we have these different rules that are applying, overlapping with one another. So that again, that elasticity there, the border is being pulled away from the border itself.
One of the implications of this kind of elasticity is it gives a fair amount of discretion to officers, and I'm thinking primarily of American custom border guards at this point, um, and shields them from consequences.
Yeah, so I think this is the danger when we have overlapping jurisdictions, is it's when you have all of these different laws that are being applied, you also have ways that people can escape from the law and that accountability that they might have otherwise. So under our current legislation, which allows these custom agents to be in Canada, it also says that they are going to be reporting to the Department of Homeland Security. So there's no accountability within the Canadian context to Canadian laws if something goes wrong. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we're facing with these increasingly complex borders that we have is the overlapping of law does not create more law and more protections. It actually creates more loopholes where people can escape their liability.
I'll give you an example. Years ago, I was trying to cross into the U.S. With a camera. I was going to go down as a journalist, and I thought I was adhering to the rules. I had read the website, and I thought, but the border guard disagreed with me. And so he said, well, you have a right to appeal to my supervisor. So I said, yes, I'd like to do that. He went and got the supervisor. The supervisor came over and said, okay, why would I disagree with my employee here? Of course I'm not going to. And then he upheld the border guard's response. And I thought, well, here's a rule. And I thought that I had a good argument, and it just got blown off right in front of me. He didn't even pretend that he took it seriously. And that was for me a little bit of an insight into, like you say, the flexibility, the elasticity of how these rules are applied.
Yeah, there's very little oversight. I mean, Canada, with our own Canadian Border Services Agency, it's our largest enforcement agency in Canada that has no oversight. They keep promising that they're going to have some oversight, but there really is not. So there's no public appeal, there's no public accountability for what they do. Similarly, in the US, where I think they act even more like rogue agents, there's very little oversight of what they do, and there's certainly that sense that they're going to be the ones who make the decisions, right? So the case that you described, they're going to stick together and there's no avenue for appeal or for you to plead your case. It's really the decision that they make is the decision that they make. And there is this expectation that at the border, the normal principles of law and protections around privacy and things like that are suspended. Like that is assumed to be a particular case where you have voluntarily presented yourself at the border that you're trying to cross into another jurisdiction, and it's really up to them to decide how they're going to treat you. Like that's our kind of baked into our understanding of how borders work. And so there are things that happen at the border, like checking your phone or your laptop, just as they would check your suitcase without a warrant, right? You wouldn't have that happen if you're walking down the street in the city. You can't just be checked without a warrant, without due cause. But it's presumed that at the border that you can be checked on any suspicion that you might be posing a threat. So there is a different kind of sense of what kind of protections we have in that situation.
I was reading one of your academic papers, and you talked about the rights accountability gap, where actually zones can be created where violence can occur with minimal redress. Violence? That caught my attention.
Well, what I was gesturing towards, it's not like we have this happening, say, at our the U.S. customs areas that are in Canada. But with the new legislation that we introduced back in 2016, we did allow those officers, U.S. officers in Canada, to carry guns, which was not allowed previously. They had to rely on the RCMP to do that work. If there was any concern, somebody needed to be detained or arrested, they would call upon the RCMP, who were weaponized at the airport. That has changed. So we do have these U.S. customs agents on Canadian soil with arms, right? And so it just increases that possibility for something to happen, especially as what they're trying to roll out is having those pre-clearance sites around customs at Canadian train stations and bus stations, having them at more airports as well. But airports are usually a little bit different of a kind of place. They're usually outside the city, they're their own little ecosystem. They're separate from, the way that the city normally runs. Whereas with train stations and bus stations, they're often right in the core of the city. And so you bring in US armed officers into a situation. We know bus stations are often quite volatile places. A lot of people hang out at bus stations or use that transport because they have fewer economic resources. They are different kinds of places. You have armed US guards in those kinds of spaces, you're creating a very different potential for violence to happen.
Well, it's a very interesting, Emily. And so if I were to sum this up, I would say that the border crossing, the rules are a whole lot more flexible and open to interpretation by the American border guards than I had previously suspected. They're, and given the new administration, open to more abuse if it turns out that way. And that there, while most people may only get turned away, there is an opportunity for people like myself or people, you mentioned some of the people who hold dual citizenship, whatever it might be. There are cases where they should be genuinely concerned before crossing the border. So is that a fair summation of what we just talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say that I'm an academic, so the Canadian Association of University Teachers has actually issued a warning to academics to only travel across the border when absolutely necessary,
Oh.
because they are concerned that people are being stopped, that academics have lots of information that they carry with them, often private information about research that they're doing and so on. And so they have issued this warning that we should not be crossing the border unless absolutely necessary, which is giving many of us, raising questions about, do we go to conferences in the United States? Do we go and continue with our research there? And we've seen academics in Canada targeted by the American government as well. in pulling back the research funds that we had in Canada through US grants. Now, that's up to them to do, but that's really a kind of a very aggressive kind of move from the Americans, where we see universities there also under attack. So I think, yes, just to go back to your summary, I do think there are very real concerns about crossing the border. I'm not saying that anybody will be picked up, but because there is this randomness that happens, that there is a potential for anyone to potentially be stopped. And so some advice that I heard was, if you are going to cross the border, you're generally not concerned, you're not somebody who's got any of these red flags, it would still be a really good idea to think of how you might answer questions, tricky questions that come at you, and be prepared to answer them. And I think, it's really important for some people to cross the border. They might have family on the other side, they might have some job opportunities, or there's good reasons. I personally do not want to cross. I do not want to go to the United States, but I understand that others might want to. But just be prepared. Think about how you might answer a question. If you're asked, what do you think of the Trump administration? How would you answer that? And I think that's a good piece of advice to have in hand.
Well, thank you very much for this. I think that it's exactly right. If you have red flags, be really careful. If you don't think you have red flags, still be careful. You should be okay, but caution is the byword here. Thank you very much for this, Emily. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.